Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. Today our guest is the journalist Peter Martell, who's covered the situation in South Sudan for the last decade, and he's just written a book called First Raise a Flag, How South Sudan Won the Longest War but Lost the Peace, published by Hearst. South Sudan became independent in 2011 after a bloody war, but already 2 years later there was a civil war that erupted, and since then tens of thousands of people have died, millions have been displaced, and the UN says the country is on the verge of another famine. This book is an eyewitness report, but it's also a book that looks at the historical causes of the conflict. So, Peter Martell, my first question is, why is it that in 1956, when Sudan became independent from Britain and Egypt, why is it that already then the South was lagging behind the North?
South Sudan, or Southern Sudan as it was in 1956, had an enormous long history of violence from outsiders. There were slave raids back into the 19th century, British colonial rule, and when it was handed over as to become an independent country, as in Sudan in 1956, the South had been left behind, as you said, very few schools, enormous lack of development. So when it became part of a united Sudan in 1956, it was already far, far behind the situation in North Sudan, becoming, as it were, already second off the starting blocks, and struggling from the very beginning.
One big issue in this book is the discovery of oil in the late 1970s in the South. What impact did this have on later conflicts?
Well, historically, the South had enormous grievances against the North. Oil, however, as you said, in the 1970s when it was found, provided the financial fuel to continue the war, to provide the guns, to provide a motivation for the government in Khartoum to keep control of the South, and for international interests to have a financial vested interest in taking control of the South. So it fueled the war.
You say in your book that in the United States in the 1990s decided to support the Southerners and push for their independence. What responsibility do they have in today's crisis?
The United States, its involvement, initially it used to support the government in the North in the early days of the war. Later on, the war between North and South Sudan, it was, in very simplistic terms, it was seen as a war between an Islamic North and a Christian South with traditional religions. And the US role became involved to some extent to support the Christians in the South. The US was fundamental in the steps towards the referendum on the independence for South Sudan, and invested significant, over billions of dollars into the South. Many would say it was done without the due care and attention. The money was spent with the best of intentions, but without the financial safeguards that allowed an elite to bolster their control of a country, without the people on the ground having a stake in it as well. It fueled the corruption and the violence that was to come.
You say in your book that President Salva Kiir and the leader of the rebels, Riek Machar, they don't control all the armed groups in the country, but it seems when we read your book that a lot of the blame lays on these two men for the current situation.
Certainly the two men, President Salva Kiir and his former deputy, his arch-rival, currently now under the peace agreement, back to be, on paper at least, to be his vice president again. These two men have fought and made up multiple times. They are the figureheads of the two largest ethnic groups in the South, the Dinka for President Salva Kiir and the Nuer for Riek Machar. But these are not monolithic blocks, and these men do not control by any means their ethnic groups. They are very influential men, but they are not the be-all and end-all. And as the war continues over 5 and a bit years now, it becomes increasingly fractured, more complex, more complicated, and the rebel groups fracture into local militia forces fighting for self-defense, for local grievances. So deals at the top between elites do not necessarily reflect the complexity of the war between smaller groups on the ground.
You say that even before independence in 2011, there was widespread corruption among southern leaders, and you say that the international community ignored it and enabled the rot to fester. Why did it do that?
There was enormous optimism and hope for South Sudan. This was at the end of the civil war in 2005 between North and South. It seemed like the steps were ahead for finally an end to what had been decades, if potentially not centuries, of violence in the South. People wanted this country to work. They wanted it to succeed. And people poured in money and development aid and support, financial, moral, political, militarily. And it was done often without the necessary safeguards. And it allowed an elite to grow at the top who saw this country almost as their personal possession, not as a representatives of the people who they were supposedly creating a country for.
At one point in your book, you talk about this British security officer who says to you, killing for these people is a game. Life is so cheap here, it means nothing. And then you write, the flippancy of his words filled me with anger. Can you explain to us why you were so angry at the time?
I lived in South Sudan for many years. I have many South Sudanese friends. I was fortunate to live in South Sudan at a time when I could drive my motorbike out into the bush and camp and stay with friends and see the hope and optimism that this country held. I feel now when I travel in the South, the security situation is dangerous, is complex. It's the world's most dangerous country in the world for aid workers. And the people who do come in often see it as a hopeless case. And I feel that that's not necessarily the case. There is still optimism ahead. And I get frustrated and anger at people who come in and see it as nothing more than a basket case, a world's worst failed state, that there's nothing ahead but gloom. The situation's not good, but it's certainly not the end of the world.
There's one major historical figure you talk about in your book. It's the Southerner John Garang. Can you tell us why he fought for the unity rather than the independence of South Sudan?
John Garang, incredibly charismatic man who more than anyone led the battle for what has since been seen for South Sudan. But you're right, as you say, and in the book, John Garang, in his rhetoric and his speeches, he argued he was fighting for what he called a new Sudan, not a South Sudan. What he wanted was a change for all the country, a change in the government in Khartoum that he wanted and believed would change the system, that would allow a representative government that would end the wars in Darfur, in the west of North Sudan, in East Sudan, in the still ongoing wars in Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile today. Unfortunately, he died in a helicopter crash very soon after the peace agreement was signed in 2005. And with him died that dreams and hopes of a unified, democratic, peaceful, united Sudan. And what we have today was the independence movement for South Sudan and the new country that it became in 2011.
You write in your last chapter that the situation now is worse than ever, and yet you still have hope. How is that?
It's all sometimes often one feels one has got left. As I said, these are my friends. These are people I've lived amongst. I called Juba, the capital in South Sudan, home for a very long time. South Sudanese have a remarkable ability, a strength and a resilience to pick themselves up despite what is on paper the worst situation in the world. In the list of failed states or fragile states, it's been ranked worse than the world for several years. A recent estimation of the death toll puts it at 380,000 in the last 5 years of war, which is in some ways, as bad, if depending on how you calculate it, as Syria or Iraq. There is every hope. There is every reason to be pessimistic. I have just seen the ability of South Sudanese to pick themselves up, to rebuild their lives, and to reconstruct communities and make peace. And on the ground, that's the only hope ahead. Not the elite deals at the top, but the people on the ground who can help still believe they can rebuild and create a new country for themselves.
Peter Martell, thank you very much. Let me remind viewers that your book is called First Raise a Flag and it's published by Hearst. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to France 24.